Who really runs the world? Now, I've long instinctually believed it's the central banks, but I haven't been able to fully understand how exactly. And my hope is our next guest tonight can do this. Richard Werner is an internationally renowned economist who wrote the bestseller Princes of the Yen, is the father of the monetary policy concept of quantitative easing, and for decades now, he has been at the forefront of sounding the alarm on incoming economic crises. Richard, welcome to the show. Excited to talk to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Um, I have to say, this is going to be the most difficult interview I think I've ever done because, monetary policy, economics, all of this is over many of our heads. The language is difficult to understand, and I feel like it's done on purpose. It's done to keep a lot of us in the dark so that we don't know what the banks are really doing and what's really happening in the shadowy world of finance. So I've done a lot of digging into this. I've done a lot of research into this, and I have to say that when I first became interested in what the central banks were doing and what's really going on was back in September of 2019, right before the pandemic hit, when there was this strange thing going on with the banks where they were bailing out the repo market. And they kept doing this over and over, right? They were dumping billions of dollars into the repo market, and something obviously odd was going on. But many of us couldn't figure out what is this odd thing that's happening. It looked like maybe the bond market was going to crash or something along those lines, really unclear. But then the pandemic hit, and we all kind of lost track of that. And but I feel like it's all connected. And so I want you to start. First of all, I want you to start with giving everyone your history in the world of economics. Now you're a professor. A lot of people think, oh, you've just been in academia this whole time, but you haven't. So can you give a quick, brief rundown of your experience?
Great. Well, let me first say, trust your instinct. I think your instinct has been spot on the money. You know, that the central banks are the key movers and shakers. And also the second point you made about, the September 2019 crisis, which seems to have been clearly one of the reasons why they accelerated some of the monetary programs that we then saw being rolled out in 2020. But we'll come to that. So, yes, I think you're spot on. Well, my background, um, I studied economics at the London School of Economics, and then enrolled for the master's and doctoral program at the University of Oxford. I'm originally from Germany, and I thought, economics was going to be a bit more practical than what they taught at these universities, because essentially they've got very abstract theoretical models, mathematical models that have a high degree of precision within their own models, with their own confines, but these models have essentially nothing to do with reality. But also, let's come back to that. But basically, just to say at this stage that I just felt, what is this? What are they teaching me? I'm interested in the real world, how economies actually function and what's going on. And when I graduated from the LSE, it was in the summer of 1989, and I thought there's a lot going on in Asia. I want to go there. I wanted to go to China, Japan. I ended up being in Japan, doing an internship at Deutsche Bank, at the peak of what, with hindsight, turned out to be the peak of this asset bubble. At the time, as you know, in the late 1980s, people did not call it a bubble. And to me, of course, that was very exciting, was going on there, going through the various departments at Deutsche Bank. Um, and and so there were a lot of questions there. Why is the stock market at this extraordinary level? The Nikkei 225 index was around close to 40,000. And at the same time, land prices were just so high, overpriced. It was incredible. So much so that a tiny plot of land in central Tokyo would have the same market value. And we're talking about something fairly small, like the Imperial Palace Garden, which is like a small park in central Tokyo, would have the same market value at these market prices as all the property of the entire state of California, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, everything, It's
Would
just
love to own that piece of
crazy.
land,
Exactly.
right?
So of course I thought, wow, what is going on? And so to me, this gap between economics, the theoretical, stuff and reality seemed so huge. And of course, I was much more interested in reality. Um, and so I sort of took time off from Oxford to go back to Japan, went to the University of Tokyo, became a graduate researcher, learned Japanese, got a job at Nomura Research Institute, learned a lot from the people there, met a lot of people in the financial sector, then um, became the first Shimomura Fellow at the Japan Development Bank, which is one of the government development banks, which is very much involved in the post-war rapid economic growth, which is the other big puzzle. How did Japan manage to have such high growth, double-digit economic growth? What's the secret? And basically, the policies they adopted did not follow the textbooks. They did not do what the economics theorists were telling us. So another puzzle to solve. Japanese capital flows in the 1980s were basically going everywhere in Asia, in America, Australia, Hawaii, buying up US companies, Columbia Pictures, Rockefeller Center, and so on. Pebbles Beach Golf Course. Where was all this money coming from, and why was so much money coming from Japan? Again, the theorists couldn't explain it. They had empirical models also that didn't work. So it was like puzzle after puzzle. And to me, that was a nice challenge. I thought, well, one needs to find answers to all these questions, which ultimately I did find. But just quickly back and just complete my answer. So I then I also went back to Oxford to try to finish my degree. Meanwhile, some of my work was published. I got job offers in Tokyo, so my doctorate was a bit delayed. I got it in the end, but I also then became chief economist at Jardine Fleming Securities in Tokyo, which was one of the sort of quite nimble investment banks, quite strong in Asia with a flat hierarchy. So they gave me a lot of responsibility early on. And I could implement my models and my approach, which is very much reality oriented. I realized that economists were basically using this theoretical approach, which is called the deductive hypothetical axiomatic approach. So they just pose these theories. And as you said at the very beginning, it sort of makes things artificially complex, while at the same time giving this impression of being scientific. But if you look at the scientific research disciplines, chemistry, biology, physics, I mean, how do they work? They use a different methodology, which is the inductive method, also known as the scientific research method. You look at data, you look at facts, and any theory or model you have has to be developed based on that data. That's scientific. And I realized once you study methodology, economics, the way it's being done in all the leading universities, is not actually scientific. It's more a political ideology to push certain preconceived ideas. They then work backwards. What assumptions do we need to be able to sell our preconceived conclusions that the theoretical models come to? Well, that's totally unscientific. And so I started what ended up being an alternative approach, what I call scientific economics, where yes, you can have theories and models, but they have to be grounded in empirical reality. The facts always drive things. Anyway, so um, I then set up my own firm advising institutional investors. Having been at Jardine Fleming very quickly, top three in Economist on Japan and in the various rankings, Greenwich Survey, Institutional Investor Survey, set up my own firm. Then realized there's such a big gap in economics. We need to really revolutionize economics by having this empirically driven, realistic economics that actually works. And we can learn a lot from Asia, successful economies like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and then of course, since Deng Xiaoping came to power in China, that as well. I went back to the UK, became professor of banking, but continued my work running a global macro fund, several global macro funds actually, Providence Asset Management, then Bear Stearns Asset Management, set up their first macro fund, hedge fund outside the US, the Bear Stearns Global Alpha Fund. So continued then to do my academic work while also advising institutional investors. I've been monitoring central bank and bank credit creation in 40 countries for many years. And that really gives you so many signals. And it's not what everyone's looking at. It's not really the interest rate that is the key signal. That's part of the smokescreen from this false economics to keep people busy with stuff. And central banks are able to distract people's attention. It's like the magician on stage. Look here, what's happening, while the other hand is doing the trick, you know. So it's not the price of money, the interest rate, that's the key tool. I found out it's the quantitative tools they're using that are more important. Hence, also when I proposed a more useful policy to get out of banking crises quickly, which I called quantitative easing. But enough on that. Let's go into details.
Okay, so you're legit. That's what all of that boils down to. Okay, I'm trying to figure out where to start, and I'm going to ask you where to start because I think that there is a connection between what you uncovered in The Princes of the Yen and how there were these anointed people, these anointed men who 30 years prior were essentially crowned to later run the country, run the banks, and even in the role of prime minister, right? They were like really, truly crowned in advance. There's also the World Economic Forum, and there's the Young
Hmm.
Global Leaders Program, which to me seems
Yes.
like a very parallel, similar thing. And you actually yourself were one of the global leaders for tomorrow. It used to be called the Global Leaders for Tomorrow. Then they changed it to the Young Global Leaders. And you actually sounded the alarm on this and said, hey, they've changed this. This used to be people they would pluck up that were smart and doing great things in their industries. And now they're grabbing people that they seem to be able to mold and direct. And we've even seen Klaus Schwab now saying things like, oh, we've infiltrated cabinets all around the world. We've got people everywhere. Our young global leaders are now everywhere. And you were sounding the alarm saying, now they're just getting people they can mold, people that they can direct, when it used to be actually the foremost thinking minds in their industries. So I feel like there's some kind of connection between what happened with Princes of the Yen, what was going on in Japan, and the young global leaders. I also feel like there's some sort of a connection with, because what you uncover in Princes of the Yen is that these crises are manufactured. The central bank in Japan had the option to get out of the recession. They didn't. They chose not to. They did it for
Yes.
political reasons. They had a
Yeah.
reason why they wanted to keep Japan in a recession, and they were doing it for their own political gain, right? Their own political end. And so then I think about, how does that relate to the 2008 economic crisis? How does that then relate to the pandemic? Because another thing that you've been exposing is that the way they gain control, the way the central bank gains control, is through absorbing community banks and essentially closing down mom and pop shops, right? Like if you can consolidate everything into the big firms, then you can control the world a lot easier. If you've got a lot of little mom and pop businesses, if you've got a lot of little community banks, which are giving the loans to those little mom and pop shops, then you're not, it's a different dynamic. So what their goal is to consolidate. So this makes me question things like the 2008 crash, and also in particular the pandemic, because one thing that
Yeah.
really, at the beginning of the pandemic, when they were closing down the economy, I can confidently say in my field of I was considered a progressive political talker. Don't know what they consider me now, but whatever, it doesn't matter. I was really the only one that was actually saying, do not shut down the economy. You do that, you're screwing over everybody. And a lot of my counterparts were saying, no, no, no. If you open the economy, you're a shill for Wall Street. This is all a game for Wall Street. We want to keep it closed. And I was saying, oh my God, you keep this closed. Let me just tell you what's gone on over the decades. It used to be back in the early 1900s, 80% of the businesses were mom and pop shops. Slowly over the decades, they've dwindled to now under 50%. And when you do that, you have consolidated power to the big Amazons, right?
Yes.
All of these big companies get it. So the pandemic accelerated this. A lot of shops went under. During the 2008 crisis, a lot of those community banks went under. So
Yeah.
can you tell us? So this is where I'm at with this. And I'm thinking all of this is somehow connected, that maybe they even manufactured the 2008 crisis, that maybe even the pandemic, not saying they necessarily released the virus on purpose. Maybe, I'm open to that idea. But even if they didn't, they took advantage of the fact that there was this virus, and they were able to then say, now is our chance to, for one, correct what was ever going on in that September 2019 repo issue. We're going to hide that or correct it, fix it. And on top of it, we're going to consolidate more control. And another thing you've been sounding the alarm on, I know I'm saying a lot here, but another thing has been digital currency. They want to move us towards this digital currency,
Yes.
which if the banks, and I want you to get into this, what the banks really do, if they really are the ones that are creating money, and we used to have run on the banks, right? Which is what the whole premise of central banks. You need a central bank that's going to control things, so there's no run on the banks. You end up with these constant crises over and over. So, well, you wouldn't ever have a run on the bank, I would imagine, if you moved to digital currency. There's no, how could you possibly? You're not going to the bank saying, give me my gold. They don't do that anymore. Now you go and give me my dollars. Okay, that could potentially cause a collapse. What happens if it's digital? They'd be like, well, the money's on your card. Don't worry about it. It's right
Yes.
there. You've got it in your wallet. So can you connect? I mean, where am I? Do you see where I'm at with this? And can you connect
Absolutely.
this? Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly all these events, all these trends are connected. And the common thread is that essentially human nature, particularly when, I think ordinary people can't really fathom this very often because I think most people are quite well-natured. And if they see somebody in trouble, they want to help. And I think that's true in almost all countries in the world. But there is a small proportion of people that are either extremely ambitious or unscrupulous or have actually some kind of problems, pathological, problems, making them somewhat psychopathic. Whatever the case may be, there is a small proportion of people that love power. And it's probably true that to some extent, everyone, if given power, is tempted to use and abuse power. There's a famous British statesman, Lord Acton, who had seen power at close hand and how it really changes people. A lot of people basically can't handle power. It corrupts them. They just want to use and abuse that power and, feel the power. They enjoy feeling the power. He said, absolute power. Well, first he said power corrupts, and then he says absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there is that tendency that not everyone can handle power, but particularly when you get the wrong people in positions of power, which often happens because they may be seeking those positions of power, then we see that power is being abused, and this power then wants more power. They just, they're not happy just with money. They literally want control. And that's really the overarching trend of the 20th century, which unfortunately is accelerating in the 21st century, namely the concentration of power into the hands of fewer and fewer people and the abuse of that power, because it is not, as the US Constitution demands, subject to checks and balances anymore. You don't have the separation of the different powers, executive, judiciary, and legislative. No, what we do have is an increasing concentration of power across the different areas, across countries, and into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And of course, the way this is exerted is through money. And that is the common thread in all the things you've said. And that's why I think we should start to unpack this by looking at money, what it does, how it works. And we always have this official story, which is a smokescreen, to hide reality, as you were saying, it's to get people off the real track. And then there's the reality, and then how things are being manipulated behind the smokescreen in order to concentrate power further. And that you can demonstrate, you can show with the data is what's been happening. But let me quickly just start perhaps by talking about the World Economic Forum, because I was invited to attend in 2003, 20 years ago, January. And they made me global leader for tomorrow. That used to be this the young people's program that they had at the World Economic Forum. And of course, I mean, it was exciting, I must say. You know, you had all these people that normally you only see on television. You know, I shook hands with Bill Clinton, the US president. You know, you meet all the current leaders. You meet, I mean, the top musicians, band leaders were all there. Um, and and of course, you know, from all scenes, business people, ministers, secretaries of state, everyone was there. So quite exciting. But I just felt because, you know, they had a program, they had topics, serious topics to discuss. And so I asked questions. They were promoting, for instance, genetically modified foodstuffs, which I know is actually quite dangerous. There's all sorts of negative consequences. Some of them just never tested, but clearly something that at least people should know if they buy something, whether it's genetically modified or not. And the seeds usually are much less fertile. You know, if any genetically modified organism, fertility goes down, and that's of course used by the big agro businesses because they want farmers to each year buy the grain anew from them. But of course, traditionally, your farmers would save some of the grain and then you plant it, which is actually a nice sort of allegory for economic growth. You know, you grow rice and you've got your bag of rice. What you eat, that's your consumption. But what you don't eat, that you save the grain, you can plant it, and the more you save, the more growth you'll have next year. But of course, by having genetically modified stuff, it doesn't work. You can't plant it, and you have to go back. So I raised that point, and they shut me down. And it was clear that this is a rig. This is not a proper conversation. It's not a proper discussion. Then the next topic was something else, you know. And of course, anything on economics, finance, banking. I was just shocked. These were very controlled conversations. And after a while, the clearly the moderators, after a few days, they've been warned about me. You know, don't pick Richard Werner, you know. And so I realized they wouldn't even, when I raised my hand, they'd see me but ignore me. So I realized this is a farce. In 2004, I then challenged the head of the ECB in front of everyone. It was a big event, plenary session. He was on stage, and the ECB at that time had just engineered a recession in Europe, particularly Germany, by taking policies that would tighten credit. There was a credit crunch, 2002, 2003, and they kept saying, "Oh, that's good, and we need this in order to have structural reform." Now, that's exactly what the Bank of Japan had done throughout the 90s. They were saying in public things like, "Oh, we like this recession because thanks to the recession, companies now learn a lesson. They need to change, and the politicians learn a lesson. We need to deregulate, liberalize, privatize. We need all these changes." Well, that's not the mandate of a central bank. So I asked the ECB head in front of everyone, where's the mandate for the ECB to demand these structural reforms that you have just demanded here in front of everyone? And he was quite unprepared. I mean, it's a mild challenge, really, if you think about it, and quite politely asked, you know, it wasn't really aggressive, but he wasn't prepared for it. And clearly, I mean, his answer was ridiculous, but also these big wigs, there was also Larry Summers. He didn't like some of my questions. You know, they all must have complained about me. What then happened after this, January 2004, the second year when I came, is very soon after, all of us global leaders for tomorrow, we're supposed to be invited for 5 years in a row. We got an email saying, "Oh, sorry, the program has been abolished. No more global leaders for tomorrow. Sorry, you're also not invited anymore." But then we found out just a few months later, they just started a new program. You mentioned it, you know, Young Global Leaders, they named it, and they selected it more carefully to make sure these are conforming people they can mold into their future elite. So at the time, I mean, at Davos, I met a young or younger Angela Merkel before she was chancellor. You know, so it was quite clear. You know, they had the future leaders among these selected people, But it was a very controlled event, and you wonder what's really behind this. Now, what's behind this is, of course, the powers that be. It's quite clear. It's a membership organization, so big business pays big money and writes the agenda of Davos, the World Economic Forum. But even big business is not as powerful as those who control money. And perhaps we should talk about that next. So, because really, any business industry, even pharmaceutical businesses that we found out, since 2020, extremely powerful and influential. But ultimately, the money power is even more
Yep.
powerful. And so, in this hierarchy of power, that seems to be the key issue. And so, perhaps we should talk a bit about that.
Yeah, it's
What do you
interesting
think?
though what you're explaining, what you were experiencing starting in 2003 is what many of us experienced during the pandemic. So we can now relate to this now that you're talking about it. Well, no, it's the conversation is already directed. You're not allowed to ask these other questions or bring up these other points, or else, the narrative has been set. And then what I find really interesting
Yeah.
is through this Young Global Leaders program that they've installed, that they've been able to actually get a lot of these people in positions of actual power. Like you mentioned, Angela Merkel, like Justin Trudeau, Jacinda Ardern. We've seen many of them actually rise up and lead nations. What are the chances of that? I mean, it's very similar to what you wrote about in Princes of the End, which, by the way, there's a documentary of this. I watched that last night. It's very fascinating. People should take the time because it is ominous in a lot of ways. How was it that these people in positions of power in Japan were able to anoint certain people 30 years prior to them rising up to becoming the prime minister, even I believe, and heads of banks? How were they able to? Are they psychic? Well, clearly they're not psychic. It's just that things aren't happening exactly the way we think. We're thinking we're living in a democratic society. Right? I mean, we're thinking we vote, these people get into power, they run for office, that's how it happens. But clearly, it must not really be happening that way if they're being named young global leaders and then they literally end up prime ministers and presidents of nations. I mean, it's really insane.
That's
So,
right.
okay, so now that we've seen that they've been controlling these narratives, they've been trying to keep people on the straight and narrow in their mind. And if not, then you get shunned, you get outcast, you go away. We don't want you here anymore. So it comes down to the people that are controlling the money. So what should we talk about next? Should it be what a bank really is and the creation of money? Maybe that, or
I
there's
think
so many
so.
places we could go with this.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But I think that's a fundamental one. That's a very important one. Where does money come from? And it turns out that most people's understanding of where money comes from and who controls money is not correct. Most people would think that the money comes from the government because that seems to make sense. And the government may delegate some of that to the central bank, but ultimately, it's a public function. It should be for the common good for everyone. There should be fairness. And somehow the government just has to put the money into circulation. Well, the reality is, no government in the whole world is creating any money. The last major economy where the government said, actually, we're going to create money, and they put several $billion in circulation, was the US government under John F. Kennedy in the year 1963. And it was the last year of his life when he challenged the Federal Reserve. And then since then, no other government has dared to do that. And so if the governments don't create money, um, who does it? Now, what JFK did in 1963 is he issued United States notes. They look exactly like the Federal Reserve notes, but same design, everything, except they weren't headed Federal Reserve notes, they were headed United States notes. And they didn't have the Fed seal. So it was a challenge to the Fed. But that's basically not happening anymore. It was an attempt. At the moment, well, or since then, what's been happening is that we have the central banks. But even the central banks only create a small amount of the money supply. um, basically the paper money. Most people don't realize that we have been using digital money, digital currency for many decades. And that's part of the current, in this debated discourse, obfuscation. They're saying, oh, let's introduce central bank digital currency because it's a digital age. We need a digital response from central banks. Well, hang on. We've been using digital currency for a long time. Central bank money is only around 3% of the money supply, the paper money, the cash. 97% is digital money created by banks. And we've been using this for decades. So we actually have been using digital currency for a long time, and it works very well, and there's no problem with it. But now central banks will come to that. They're saying, hey, we need central bank digital currency. Well, why? But they want more power. I mean, that's quite obvious. The central banks want more power. But before we come to that, let's just understand the status quo, what's currently happening, what has been happening for most of the last century, is that banks create money. Now, how do banks create money? Essentially, a banking license is a license to create money and put it into circulation. And that's also where what you mentioned at the beginning, this obfuscation comes in. Economics doesn't tell you that. Did you know that when you study economics, particularly when you study it on a more advanced level, and maybe do a master's in economics or a doctorate, there's no banks. All the economic models, economic theories, they leave out banks. There's no banking in it. And of course, we know with hindsight, well, actually, that's a crucial function. These are the creators of the money supply. And if you leave those out, people don't really understand how it works by coincidence. Convenient, isn't it? So how do banks put money into circulation? How do banks create money? When a bank gives out a loan, a bank loan, the money for the bank loan doesn't exist yet until you get the money paid to your account. That is the creation of new money. So effectively, banks don't lend money, they create money. And they create it when they do what we call a bank loan. So the money for a bank loan, which is the technical term is bank credit, credit creation, that is new money creation that newly adds to the money supply. So the more banks do what we call lending, normally, the more money is being created and added to the money supply. Now, of course, even though banks do this and they create the majority of the money supply through lending, central banks, of course, are very much aware of that. Now, I produced the first empirical paper, empirical test to prove this because that was controversial. And a few years ago, people were saying, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. Was Professor Werner saying that banks create money? What a conspiracy theory. So I thought, well, and for 100 years, there's been this debate about where does money come from and how do banks actually work? Because today, if you look at the latest finance journals and finance textbooks, they all say, oh, banks are just financial intermediaries. They gather deposits, and the money they lend out is the deposit money they're lending out, which is not true. But you see, that's how they hide the reality of money creation. So I did an empirical test. I mean, what's the scientific thing to do? Can you believe it? For 100 years, economists have been arguing, oh, it's the financial intermediation theory of banking that's correct. And a few were saying, no, it's the credit creation theory that's correct. Others were saying it's the fractional reserve theory is correct. That's a third theory, which is in between, which says that each individual bank is just an intermediary, but somehow collectively there's money creation in the system. That one was popular until the 1960s. And then currently, since then, we have the current financial intermediation theory dominating, which says, no, banks don't create money. We've got three theories of banking. How do we find out which one is true? Do a scientific test. And so I did that. You need the corporation of a bank. I found one that agreed and let me look inside under the bonnet, so to speak, how the money creation was actually taking place. And I could empirically establish, this is in two peer-reviewed, published in peer-reviewed journals, published articles, that it is the credit creation theory, the oldest, which was known until 100 years ago, that banks create money out of nothing when they lend. Now, the key is this. Because banks are so powerful, they create new money. They actually have a lot of influence over how the economy is going to be shaped currently and in the years ahead, because the decision by banks of how much money to create and then also who to lend this money to for what type of transactions for what purposes, that will reshape the economic landscape very quickly. And basically there's three scenarios. If banks create credit and it's used for asset purchases, property, real estate, financial assets. Because bank credit is money creation, it's like printing money and injecting it into, say, the property market. What's going to happen with property prices? You don't need a
Inflation, right?
PhD
Yeah,
to
right.
figure this out. You're
Yeah,
going to push up asset prices. Exactly. You get asset
yeah,
inflation if you have bank credit going into asset markets. And that's very bad because that's an artificial asset boom, which is unsustainable. And if you keep doing this for a few years, the moment the music stops and banks stop creating credit for asset purchases, asset prices will not go up any further, but then the late coming speculators will go bust. And then the banks have non-performing loans. They will reduce lending, even to the economy. You get a recession, a downturn, and the banking crisis, because essentially the assets are the collateral for the loans. And when you have this asset bubble, usually asset prices go up 100%, 200%. And from that peak, if they only drop by around 10%, you have a banking crisis because you wiped out bank
yeah.
capital
And that's
because
what happened in
non-performing loans have
Japan,
to be paid from bank
right?
equity.
So
That's
that's
what
what
happened
happened
in
in
Japan,
Japan.
precisely.
Is
This,
is that what also happened in 2008?
yes, that's also what happened in 2008. In fact, I warned in my book, Princes of the Yen, that from what I found out, and I met Alan Greenspan, who was at the time heading the Fed, that he was on track to do the same thing. And as it turned out, as his successor in the US. And I warned in the last chapter in Princes of the Yen that um, if the Fed keeps on doing that, we'll get the same thing in the US, but this time much bigger, and will lead to a global financial crisis.
Yeah. So
Because
one
that's
thing
what
that
happened
you
in 2008.
in Princes of the Yen, you say that it was on purpose, that the Central Bank of Japan did this purposefully. Why? First, two questions on that. Why would they do it purposefully? And secondly, if the same thing happened in 2008, was that also done purposefully by our central banks?
Yes. Now, of course, initially when I researched this in Japan, I, I had very different ideas, and I certainly didn't expect that conclusion to emerge from the research that the central bank would do this on purpose. So initially, just analyzing the events, um, excuse me, I thought this must be a mistake, a policy mistake. But then I could demonstrate more and more that they knew exactly what they were doing. This was true also for the 1990s when they prolonged the recession. I had many meetings with central bankers, and I kept asking them, um, why don't you reflate the economy? It's not very difficult. It's a post-asset bubble banking crisis. It's very easy to get out. I had already published my proposal on how to get out. All you need is for the central bank to purchase the non-performing assets from the banks at face value. It's an accounting operation inside the banking system. Central bank and the banking system together. I mean, the banks and the central bank are the banking system, and the central bank can just purchase these non-performing assets. You shift them from the banks to the central bank. That doesn't lead to inflation because there's no money injection into the non-bank economy. You're just cleaning up the bank balance sheets. Problem solved. No taxpayer money used. Can be done, has been done in history, like in Japan in 1945 after the war, or when the First World War broke out in Europe. The Bank of England did this because the British banks were bust. And they thought, oh, we've just declared war on Germany and her allies. Not a good time to have a banking crisis. Let's not have one. We're buying those non-performing assets. End of story, no cost, because it's just an accounting transaction. So it could have been done. And I explained this, and also other policies I suggested. You can push money into the economy by purchasing performing assets from the non-bank sector. I even wrote about how, because Tokyo doesn't have many parks, it's not a very green city. Well, and if you've got a real estate crisis, coming and a recession happening and the banks are bust. Well, why doesn't the Bank of Japan purchase the land in central Tokyo when there's, some company going bankrupt and turns it into parks, Bank of Japan parks? It would inject new money into the economy, and the central bank, there's basically no limit. Of course, they can quickly end the deflation. They can quickly create demand and have a recovery, but they didn't do it. So on all these proposals, they kept saying, making excuses, for these and these reasons, we're not doing it. But then some central bankers took me aside and said, look, particularly, over dinner, it's all off the record. And they told me, look, of course we know we could do this. Of course, any central bank can quickly create a recovery. We know that. I mean, you can even create inflation if you want to. That's coming back to 2020 in a moment. But we don't want to. What do you mean you don't want to? Well, this recession is really what Japan needs. What do you mean the recession is what Japan needs? Well, they were saying that Japan needed structural reforms, deregulation, liberalization, privatization. The economy was too successful. America was complaining. There was huge trade surpluses. How can we reduce the trade surplus, make Japan less successful? Adopt this economist's advice of deregulation, liberalization, privatization, and the trade surplus will disappear. Domestic demand will grow. There will be more consumption. And that's much better. We need to do that to help the international community. Japan needs to fit in. Just can't be this successful, exporter and focusing only on exports. Oh wow! And so I still didn't believe it though when they told me. I mean, literally several central banks told me the story. I thought that must be some kind of crazy explanation of their mistakes. And so I still worked on that basis. These are just mistakes. But then I had other data sources and just analyzing the bank credit data, and then going back to the bubble in the 80s, because that was clearly the cause of the big recession. Japan had a 20-year recession, the 90s and 2000s, all recession, depression. But all that followed from the bubble era of the 1980s, the late 1980s. That's the cause. So why did that happen? And then I analyzed that very carefully. Empirically, I interviewed people and I managed to get the relevant data. And the conclusion was that the banks were doing this lending for asset purchases at an extraordinary pace, enormous amounts of money being given to any company to purchase real estate. That was what was driving up the real estate prices to these extraordinary levels I mentioned, It was the banks lending so much, but why were they lending so much? And I found that the loan officers in the bank branches, they've been given orders by the headquarters to increase lending, and the bank headquarters have been given orders by the Bank of Japan to increase lending for asset purchases, for real estate purchases. And then I asked and interviewed the central bank people who in the 80s were in this job, giving those, it was called guidance, window guidance of increased bank lending now by this much, by that much. And there were huge numbers. So I asked them, why did you give this guidance? And yeah, they confirmed we did give this guidance. It was the Bank of Japan telling the banks to increase lending for asset purchases, creating that for the bubble. So why did you do that? Well, we were told by our boss, who was at the time in the late 80s, Mr. Fukui. And they told me, and in fact, the bankers already had told me, this Mr. Fukui is behind this. He is tipped, he was actually selected to be the future governor of the Bank of Japan. He's therefore known as the Prince. Everyone knows that he will be future governor. And this, of course, is exactly what happened. Just after my book was published, Princes of the Yen, pointing out that he's the future governor, then he was actually appointed to be that governor of the Bank of Japan. Well, why would he do that? Now, he actually and his boss, in this hierarchy of princes, there is a higher ranking prince, his predecessor. Together, they had this plan to change the Japanese economic structure. To do what America had been demanding from Japan and the Structural Impediments Initiative, all these negotiations with America, to essentially deregulate, liberalize, privatize, weaken the economy, reduce exports, and increase domestic demand to increase maybe imports from America and other countries. That was the goal. And they concluded, you can't do this without a crisis. We need to engineer crisis. And that's what the Bank of Japan delivered. So it was true. It was done by the central bankers on purpose. And once you're through that, then you realize how much power these central bankers have because they can control the money creators, the banks. And through that, you can move the business cycle up and down. And it's moved by the quantity of bank credit and also how the bank credit is used, whether it's used for asset purchases or whether it's used for GDP transactions for the real economy. And they have this power, and that power, that is an extraordinary power tool. Power, unfortunately, corrupts, and they have been abusing this power to create boom and bust cycles and business cycles. And as I warned, therefore, in my book already, that the ECB is being created to be too independent. The ECB was given more powers than any other central bank. It was not accountable to any government. It wasn't accountable to any parliament. And it had all these powers. No public prosecutor can search the ECB. They can't be arrested for any crime. They're like above the law. And I wrote about the danger that this poses, and they're likely to play the same game as the Bank of Japan, namely to abuse the power, create bank credit driven asset bubbles, banking crises and recessions and these boom and bust cycles to engineer political change. As soon as the book was published, Princes of the Yen, by the way, quantumpublishers.com is the place to get it because at Amazon you don't actually get the original version. As soon as I published the book, Princes of the Yen, the ECB did just that. It created huge bank credit-driven bubbles in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, which expanded bank credit by 20%, 30%, 40% year-on-year bank credit growth, all going into asset markets. The same principle, and it's a very simple system basically. With this, everyone is happy. They're having capital gains. Everyone thinks this is going great. It's a huge boom. But as soon as the central bank tells the banks to stop this, the asset bubble collapses and the banks are bust. And then the economies are bust. You basically have a huge recession. That's exactly what we had. And they called it the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. Well, basically it was Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, and some smaller countries where the ECB had boosted bank credit in the previous years for asset purchases massively, just like in Japan in the 80s. And now everyone was bust and the banking system was bust. And the central bank, the ECB, had the key to get out of this. And they used this to get political concessions. Like, you have to hand over your sovereignty now. We need to have control over fiscal policy, has to be all given to Brussels, and the EU and the ECB have to have all the powers. So they strengthened all these powers, and the ECB was then given more powers after the crisis. This is something I'd also warned about in Princes of the Yen, and also my other work, that central banks unfortunately have an incentive to create crises, because after each crisis, they claim, oh, it's because we don't have enough powers. And they're actually given more powers. And this has happened so many times. And I warned about this before the 2008 crisis. And what happened, of course, after the 2008 crisis, they were all given more powers, even more powers. And of course, that's what now we're in the next, this is like getting next level abuse of this power when we talk about 2020 and what they really want to do now with all this power, which gets really scary.
It's really interesting because what I've always said was that the Germans figured it out finally. I mean, there was World War I, there was World War II, and they finally figured out that if you really want to conquer these countries, you've got to do it financially. And that seems to be what has sort of happened in Europe in a lot of ways. When I was in Italy for a while, the Italians even, you just talk to them at parties or something. They say, oh, yeah, we're not really in control anymore. The Germans are really kind of in control of us. They kind of have this idea that they're not really, that they're bankrupt or they're economically not doing well. And so they feel like they're being controlled. Yeah.
Kim, that's still part of the smokescreen, though. I mean, that's, of course, what the ECB wants people in Greece and Italy to think, oh, it's the Germans, they're insisting on this when the ECB is in Frankfurt. Well, Germany has zero influence over the ECB. The leading members of the ECB from Germany, they quit in disgust by the abuse of power at the ECB.
So who
And
is it?
Germany as a state has no power. Exactly. Who's really behind this? Well, it goes back to the people that are heading it. For a long time, it was Mario Draghi who was running these policies before Trichet, who had challenged at Davos, and the people behind them that put them into this position of power. And I mean, Draghi made it an official ECB policy to reduce the number of banks in Europe. And Germany has the largest number of banks. Most of them are community banks, small local community banks that lend only to small and medium-sized enterprises. And that was the backbone of 200 years of German economic success. Well, the ECB was killing that, and that was official policy. There's too many banks. Germany's overbanked. The Eurozone is overbanked. Under the ECB's reign, which is only 23 years, more than 5,000 banks have disappeared in the Eurozone. And that's been their official policy. So Germany has been, just like Italy and Spain, suffering from the ECB's policies, actually. That's the reality. But of course, they like to hide. They don't like to show that it's really the ECB that is taking these policies. It's not anymore governments. Governments, with the introduction of the ECB, governments gave up their power to this international organization. The ECB is above all these countries. It's not accountable to any country. It's not accountable to any government. It's not accountable to any democratic assembly, no parliament in Europe. And they have diplomatic passports. For all the European countries, the Eurozone countries, the euro, the ECB currency, is a foreign currency. So they've handed over the most important power, which is monetary policy, to this external organization.
Yeah.
And the ECB, sure enough, as I warned, immediately abused that power to create boom and bust cycles. But that was just another major episode. So there's Japan, there's what the ECB did. But in a way, this is all just really preliminary events to what happened then in 2020.
Yeah. And really, even here in the United States, when you talk about when the power was given away, I mean, when you think of Fed, I mean, it's who controls the Fed. I mean, the governments gave away the ability to make money. The governments gave away monetary policy. So it's no longer even in the hands of the government. They're
Exactly.
not, we the people are not in charge of any of this monetary policy at all. It's just made by people that are not accountable. These private banks, essentially, that are, I mean, it's just that are the heads. I mean,
Yes,
it's just
because in the
right,
US, actually, as you say, the Federal Reserve banks are privately owned. They're 100% privately owned, the Federal Reserve banks. Now, they did establish in Washington what they call the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. And that's
right.
in Washington. And that's sort of the political that arm where there is the sort of the appearance is given that this political influence can be exerted, but essentially they only do the official policy, which is mostly interest rate policy and some other selected policies. But the real policy is implemented by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They do the day-to-day quantitative policy, the credit creation policy, and the management of the banking system. And the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is 100% privately owned. We saw that in the 2008 crisis, that some people thought, oh, JP Morgan is getting 20 billion here, 20 billion there to bail out this and buy up that bank from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And the director, the CEO of JP Morgan is also director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Is that strange? That's, because it's privately owned, it's owned by the Wall Street banks.
Yeah.
That's of course how the show worked. But really all that came to a head in 2020. And now maybe I should mention the other two ways in which money creation affects the economy. So one way is, and it's a bad way, when you create bank credit, you create money through bank lending and it's used for asset purchase. And we've discussed that you get the asset bubble, asset inflation, then a banking crisis that can be used to have a long recession if you want to, 20 years in Japan. But there's two other possibilities. So bank credit can also be used for consumption. Now, if you create a lot of bank credit for consumption, then, well, obviously there's going to be more spending by
Right.
definition. But
And
if
that's what
the
we're
bank
getting
credit,
now, right?
well, exactly, since 2020, that was the policy in 2020. So if you create and inject more money for consumption, but you don't have more goods and services, what's going to
Yeah.
happen? Well, prices of consumer goods must shoot up. And that's what they organized from March 2020. But before we discuss that, let me just mention the third possibility, because we shouldn't forget that actually, if run properly, a banking system can be a great thing and it can deliver what's good for everyone. That's, I mean, politicians should really be made aware of this. We can have high, sustainable, equitable, non-inflationary growth, double digit, 10% growth in almost all countries is possible without inflation and without crises, and very stable growth at that. That can be done. How do you do it? Well, you must make sure that bank credit, when banks lend, is not used for asset purchases, and bank credit is not used for consumption. If you make sure that it mainly goes into what is the third possibility in the redeeming feature of banking, namely for business investment in the production of new goods and services, for the implementation of new technologies, for making things more productive, for adding value, then what you get is, because you are creating more money when you lend, but this is used now productively, and now you therefore will have more goods and services of higher value, you will have no inflation. You also will have sustainable income streams to service and repay these loans, so you will not have a banking crisis.
Right.
And that is really what you need to do. And that's, of course, now, and I can see from, I can read off your face that you immediately see that this is what Japan did, this is what Korea did, this is what Taiwan did, and what China did in this high growth phase. They essentially used the window guidance tool, where the central bank monitors bank credit on a high level, not detailed which company is getting the money, but which industrial sector, and is it for consumption, is it for asset purchase, is it for business investment? And they made sure that bank credit was used mainly for business investment. And that's how you get 10% growth, 15% growth, low inflation, and very stable and equitable economic growth. That's how you can expand an economy, make small and medium-sized firms, and also, the middle class well off, and have a basically
Right.
what we
So,
consider economic success. It can be done, it's possible. But the
and that
central
makes
planners,
sense.
unfortunately, are not
Right.
choosing to do this. They're doing something
Right.
else.
Right. And that makes sense. It makes sense that job creation would be the thing that actually sustains the economy, doesn't cause
Exactly.
inflation. It's a much healthier society for sure. But so question about that, because during 2020, they not only did they give people money, right? They gave everybody a bit of money to try to supposedly sustain themselves or whatever, but they did create those PPP loans, right? And they gave those to businesses in order to maintain jobs. Now that sounds a bit different than what you're talking about, because you're talking about growth, loans for growth. Is it the same concept if you give loans for just stick around, don't don't kill jobs, don't go anywhere?
Yes, exactly. That's not very productive. I mean, most people realize that what happened in 2020 was not very productive when these loans were given to companies. But actually, that's still a drop in the ocean. There was a much bigger problem. And that was really what created this inflation. Namely, the central banks adopted the type of QE I was recommending for Japan for a deflationary situation with a bust banking system and money supply contracting. My recommendation was central banks should purchase the non-performing assets from banks and the performing assets from non-banks. That way you get the bank balance sheets cleaned up, and by purchasing assets, central bank purchase of assets from non-banks, you're pushing money straight into the economy. That's what they did in March 2020. But the problem was that bank credit was already growing at 5, 6%. And in most countries, banks were doing fine. Bank credit was expanding. There was no deflation. but they were using a tool designed for a deflationary, contractionary situation. And they expanded money supply even more. So we had record, post-war record money supply expansion. And this was done by the central banks purchasing these assets. They hired the likes of BlackRock to do this for them and just go out and purchase assets. And they used central bank money to fund this. Now, that is direct money injection into the economy. And it was given to essentially asset owners and a whole lot of rich people, owners of some big businesses and financial players, made a fortune by this trillions of money being pumped into the economy directly from the central bank through this process of purchasing assets from non-banks. Now, they did this globally, and by the fact that it was so coordinated, it's a very specific policy, that is very rarely taken. I recommended it for Japan in 1994, 1995. For 20 years, the Bank of Japan has said, oh, we don't know what you're talking about. This is not possible. We can't do this. March 2020, come March 2020, the Bank of Japan knew exactly how to do it. And every other central bank, a major central bank, did it at the same time. And of course, that proves that it's not a coincidence. It's not a policy mistake, because it's a very, very specific policy. And by coincidence, they all took it in March 2020. So clearly, they knew exactly what they were doing. But that was the policy to create inflation. If you do this, you know for sure you're going to get inflation. That's why I warned from May 2020 onwards, when I had the data, they are creating significant inflation that's going to happen 18 months later. And that's exactly what happened. So it was a central bank policy choice, like, by the way, already in the 1970s, when most people think, oh, the 70s, that was the inflationary decade. That was due to OPEC and the oil embargo and all that oil stuff and the war in the Middle East. That's
Sounds
the
really
same story
similar.
they're trying to sell us,
Right. Yeah. Sounds
now.
exactly the
But
same.
really, it's not true. Already then, it was also the central banks doing this, if you look at the data.
Why would they do this? What's the point? I mean, I hear you. You're saying they're trying to create a crisis because when you create a crisis, then you can affect change. What is the change you think they're trying to do right now to us?
Yes, well, actually, we have to look at the picture, the big picture of what has happened since 2020. And on the one hand, the central bankers have come out since 2020 very quickly, already in March 2020, with some public statements about what they want to do. And surprise, surprise, they want to introduce CBDCs. So that is clearly one goal. Now, in order to introduce central bank digital currencies, what they need is digital IDs. And clearly, they've been working backwards from their goal. How can we introduce CBDCs? We need an excuse. And then work backwards. What do we need for that? We need digital IDs. Well, again, how do we introduce digital IDs? We need another excuse to do that. Well, the so-called pandemic delivered a great excuse. Well, at least they thought. I mean, it wasn't really very convincing, but somehow they argued that you needed to be injected with this experimental substance, and then somehow you needed, in order to enter any restaurant or shop, you needed digital ID confirming that you'd been injected, when of course it was very quickly clear that this injection was not actually slowing transmission or preventing illness, and had a lot of risks attached to them. So the justification wasn't very strong, but they definitely pushed these digital IDs, the so-called vaccine passports, very hard, and again in a coordinated fashion. So you see where this is going. And the goal is actually on the monetary side. That is the prize they're aiming for. They're aiming for CBDCs connected to digital IDs. And that means we're talking about the most totalitarian control system in human history. Because this is a control tool that not only gives you, as a controller, complete visibility of what everyone is doing, every transaction, The money's moving from where to where, you know everything. But the monitoring is only one aspect. And of course, you can use that information for your purposes if you're the controller, the central planner. But actually, these CBDCs are programmable, and you can use um, tools, algorithms, big data algorithms, which they sell as artificial intelligence, in order to have rules about who can buy what for what purpose, at what time, and at what place, where, and therefore control your movement, control all your activities. And oh, Kim, you were critical of central banks recently. Oh, your CBDC is not working today, is it? Or you're trying to buy this book. Oh, you can buy another book, but not that one. That's a bit too critical of central banks. So you can see this. I mean, this in history and also the human history of dictatorships, there's never been such a powerful control tool as they're about to introduce. And that is the big prize they're aiming for, I think.
That is really scary. Um, what can we do you think, to prevent this from happening? I mean, are you a proponent of going back to the gold standard, or I mean, what should we be doing to prevent this? Because this is very frightening. And you're right, it's a total, complete way to control people. They can shut down your bank accounts at any time. We saw them do that with the trucker convoy in Canada, and we saw them go after
Precisely,
them. Yeah.
precisely,
So they can do
exactly.
this
And that was
and
even
control
before
everything. Right.
CBDCs. So exactly. So we'll definitely use CBDCs to shut down opposition. People want to demonstrate. Well, suddenly they can't buy food. So, what can we do? Well, you mentioned gold. I like gold. Going back to basics is always good. Actually, when you go into the monetary history, the ancient monetary systems were not even based on gold and silver. That came later. The oldest are simply credit systems of mutual records of credit. And you can see this easily being recreated in any small village. You go to this village pub, um, and you don't have cash with you, and they know you. Okay, we'll write it down. That's how it starts. People trade with each other and they just write it down. Well, you just need something more visible than that. There was a very elaborate system in England for hundreds of years based on tally sticks, where you make notches, and they could be split in the middle. They're wooden sticks, and one was kept at a central place, the foil, and the stock would circulate because it was a stick. Comes from the German word for stick, stock. That's where stocks and shares comes from. And then if you have doubts, you can always check whether the two parts of the tally, the split tally, match. If they match, they tally, it tallies. And if they don't, you were foiled because the foil didn't match the stock. And they had a big procedure for basing their whole accounting on this, where a lot of the financial expressions actually come from this system at the Exchequer in England. There was a big chessboard to do the calculations. That's where the word Exchequer comes from, and also checks when you pay with a check. There was a roll, which was actually from vellum, which is like cow skin, where they took the notes. It was the counter roll, contre roll in French. The Normans spoke French when they introduced this. That's where the word control comes from. The audit system comes from. So we could have basically, somebody in every village could have a record of key transactions, and you could have a credit-based system from scratch, very, very simply. It could also be run on an Excel spreadsheet if you have electricity, but it's probably good to have it on paper if electricity gets shut off or there's a power cut. And of course, you can use gold or silver as the measures of the units of account if you want, grams of gold and silver. And so basically, you could go back to a system that's anchored to gold and silver, and then you can have credit on top of that, which is just a local record of who owes what. And there's your monetary system. Now, of course, that is in effect in place when you have a community bank or you have several small local community banks that only engage or mainly engage with the local community, which is really my recommendation for the interim. We still have a bit of time because the central planners have realized they can't force the CBDCs on us just yet. And they've also, it looks like last year, they've decided to take the slow road to CBDCs, which is the so-called wholesale CBDC. That's the Chinese version of CBDCs, whereby the banks are not yet driven out of business. Retail CBDCs, as you mentioned, that's ultimately the central bank competing against the banks. It means the central bank will offer an account at the central bank for everyone. And when they do that, then of course, as soon as you have a crisis, everyone will shift their money from the banks to the central bank, and then the banking system is finished. That's ultimately what they want, because what do the central planners want? Well, they want centralization of that power. But at the moment, the banks create money. They create most of the money. So they ultimately, it looks like they want to compete against the banks. That's what they're saying when they talk about CBDCs. And they will, they have the power to drive the banks out of business if they introduce these retail CBDCs. But in China, where they had a Soviet-style system with one central bank and no banks, and that seems to be what the central bankers want to reintroduce. But in China, they created thousands of banks only 40 years ago. In the last 40 years, thousands of banks were created, and that's how China was so successful, because a decentralized system with many banks creating money and small banks lending to small firms, because big banks don't lend to small firms. That's how you get economic growth. That's how you make sure small firms and small mom and pop shops are doing well. If you've got small local banks, that's how China is successful. So China refused to introduce the retail CBDCs because that kills the banks. They introduced what is called wholesale CBDCs, where the central bank digital currency can only be obtained through a bank, and therefore the banks are safe. It looks like they've conceded that, and in Europe and America, when they introduce CBDCs, will also be the wholesale CBDCs, which is good news. That means we have a bit of time to establish more community banks and anchor them in the local community, and then we can also prepare, basically put in place systems for when they want to shut down the community banks and have central, retail CBDCs. Then we can switch to a local system that is using the local bank, but is linked to gold and silver as a numeraire, and that can work very effectively.
Yeah, and it seems like the pandemic might have shown them that we're not quite that easy to control. There's still a substantial number of us that are like,
Yes, there is
no,
hope. There
not
is
doing
hope.
that. Yeah. Yeah, so that is, I think, the hope there is that we can push back on this, and especially awareness. I think the awareness of the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset, what central banks are doing, really just kind of saying, we're on to you, right? We're on to what you're trying to do to us, that you're trying to consolidate power, control us through digital IDs, control us through digital money, get us to the point where, yes, everything is, that's why they're saying you will own nothing and you will be happy because all of that would be centralized. Somebody else would own it. We wouldn't. Same thing
Yeah.
with the banks, no community banks, suck them up because it's all centralized. You don't, none of that is for the little guy. It's all for the big players. And then they control all of the rest of us like puppets. It's really, it's great that we are becoming more aware, that we're talking more about this. And then hopefully by doing that, we will have some rogue political leaders who will say, we're not falling for it. And we're going to set up some systems to protect ourselves, to isolate our states or our communities in some way. That seems to be the hope moving forward. And as you mentioned, advocating for
Exactly.
small community banks. And now I'm thinking, I got to go get a small community bank. I got to go start banking at a credit union or something.
Yes, you should. You should. You should. Yes. And I'm also working to set up new community banks. So if any of your viewers wants to join, get in touch with me. ProfessorWerner.org is a website where I've got also my work and my scientific articles there. There's also an email to get in touch, or follow me on
Okay.
Twitter, Scientific Econ, or Professor Werner.
Great.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you. Thank you so much for having this conversation and enlightening us a bit on this very scary, ominous future that we may be heading towards. and really just the power of central banks and what they've been doing, and the fact that we can probably blame most of the crises we've had on them and what they've been and their ultimate goals of trying to control us. It's very scary.
Yes, and we need to hold them to account, which we can and we should. And for that, more people need to understand how the system works.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, economics has not been very helpful because they suppress the reality, they suppress the truth. But I'm trying to have the scientific economics, which is empirical, data based. And with that, you can show the facts and we can try to hold them to account because the people are the sovereign and it's not the other way around.
We got to keep it that way, that's for sure. Or at least gain it back if we've already lost it a bit. But Richard, thank you so much for being here. Really nice chatting with you.
Thank you. It was really good to speak to you, and thanks for having me. Thank you very much.